It's a great privilege to be with you today, and I really identify with so much that the other speakers have already addressed, because as you just said in your introduction, although my topic tonight is the situation in Hong Kong, I've worked extensively throughout the region. I've been deported from Burma or Myanmar not once but twice, and I've traveled to that country more than 50 times, both inside the country and to the border areas to visit the ethnic and religious minorities, the Rohingyas, but also other minorities. I've focused a lot on the plight of the Uyghur in China, which has already been mentioned, but also other religious groups in China, Christians, Falun Gong, Tibet, and others. And North Korea has been a focus, and religious intolerance in Indonesia. So there's a lot there, and I can't possibly cover all of that in 5 to 7 minutes, and I know I'm not asked to, but maybe in the Q&A we can come back to some of those issues. But let me turn to specifically the situation in Hong Kong. It's worth just saying that I lived in Hong Kong from 1997 to 2002, the first 5 years after the handover. And when I left Hong Kong in 2002, up until the umbrella movement in 2014, you may recall the protests 6 years ago, during that period from 2002 to 2014, on the whole, I would say that one country, two systems, the basis on which Hong Kong was returned to China in 1997, worked pretty well. And on the whole, maybe not perfectly, but on the whole, Hong Kong's freedoms were protected and its autonomy was respected. And what we are seeing now is the dramatic dismantling and destruction of what has been, until fairly recently, one of Asia's most open and freest cities. And in fact, the only city under Chinese sovereignty where basic freedoms like freedom of the press, freedom of religion, and other basic human rights have been, as I say, until relatively recently, respected. But over the last 6 years, and increasingly over the last year, we've seen the destruction of those freedoms. And that's really why I started to begin to advocate for Hong Kong when I saw what was happening with the umbrella movement. I started to advocate for Hong Kong in my spare time, kind of on top of all the other countries that have been mentioned already. My advocacy increased over the years with hosting a number of Hong Kong activists who came to the UK, writing about the situation. And then I guess my own involvement escalated when I tried to visit Hong Kong in 2017, having been back a number of times over the years since I'd left. But in October 2017, I tried to make a visit to the city that had once been my home. And I was turned away at the airport on the orders of Beijing and told that I was not welcome in Hong Kong. And then I founded Hong Kong Watch in order to be an organization to speak out for Hong Kong. But what we've seen in the last few years has been, as I say, an increasing erosion and destruction of Hong Kong's freedoms. Going back to 2015, the abduction of Hong Kong-based booksellers who were publishing books critical of the Chinese Communist Party leadership, they disappeared and were abducted into the mainland. A succession of pro-democracy candidates and legislators who were disqualified. In one case, the case of Nathan Law, who is a friend of mine and who I've hosted in London, who was elected as the youngest legislator at the age of 23. When he took his oath totally properly, but he just added some words from Mahatma Gandhi. You quoted Gandhi in the film at the beginning of this session. Well, he quoted Gandhi when he took his oath, and he was then disqualified as a legislator and actually ended up then in prison for his role in the umbrella movement. We've seen the expulsion not only of myself, but of a growing number of foreign journalists and activists. The Financial Times Asia news editor, Victor Mallet, expelled from the city. The executive director of Human Rights Watch, Ken Roth, denied entry. And then last year, things took on a whole new level when the Hong Kong government tried to introduce this extradition law that would have allowed for the extradition from Hong Kong, a city based on the rule of law, into mainland China, which is a place that has no rule of law. It's rule by law, where there's no such thing as an independent judiciary or a fair trial. People are arbitrarily arrested, disappeared, tortured, even executed. And so we saw these protests over the last year, which were, the vast majority of them were peaceful. They certainly started off peacefully. We saw at one point 1 million people marching peacefully, and then 2 million people marching. The protests did turn, in a small minority of cases, violent. And I don't in any way condone the violence, but I do think that we need to understand why they turned violent, and that was partly because of the police brutality that they faced, and it was the police who really initiated the violence, but also a government that refused to listen to their cries. And so the whole situation escalated right up to the point where now, in May this year, the Chinese Communist Party regime in Beijing caught everyone, I think, by surprise by announcing that they would impose a national security law on Hong Kong. That national security law was expected to be introduced at some point because Hong Kong's own constitution, the basic law, actually does require a security law to be introduced at some point. But we expected it to be introduced through the Hong Kong legislature and be debated and scrutinized. And instead it was imposed through the National People's Congress in Beijing. It was fast-tracked through in the space of just over a month. And on the 1st of July, the Chinese Communist Party essentially decimated whatever remained of Hong Kong's autonomy and freedoms in flagrant breach of the Sino-British Joint Declaration, an international treaty that is valid until 2047, and with dire consequences for human rights. So much so that this security law makes it a crime for Hong Kong people in Hong Kong to advocate for themselves to the international community. That's deemed to be collusion with foreign political entities. It also has an extraterritorial application in Article 38 of the security law, which absurdly makes it a crime under Hong Kong law for anyone, whether they're a Hong Konger or not, wherever they are in the world, to breach that law. So in effect, what I'm saying to you today, speaking to you from the UK, to people in different parts of the world, not in Hong Kong, I'm in breach of the security law in Hong Kong, probably, and I'm in breach of the security law pretty much every day in what I do. Since the imposition of the security law, we've seen the disqualification of pro-democracy candidates, the postponement of the elections that were due to be held in September, multiple arrests, and the total disenfranchisement and destruction of Hong Kong's freedoms. And let me just conclude. Conclude with 2 points very quickly. I know much of the focus in this discussion is on freedom of religion or belief. And I think that will be inevitably affected by this law. We haven't seen direct signs of it yet, but I think where freedom itself is destroyed, freedom of religion will be sooner or later impacted, and we could come back to that in the Q&A if people want to. But I just close finally by asking, what can we do about this situation? And there are basically 3 things that I think we should be doing. I think we should be putting those responsible for this breach of an international treaty under as much pressure as possible, and that includes targeted sanctions, not sanctions against China as a country or China as a people or the Hong Kong people, but targeted sanctions against people in the Chinese and Hong Kong governments. And we've seen that today with the announcement from Washington, D.C. that Carrie Lam, Hong Kong's chief executive, will be sanctioned. Secondly, we need to be preparing to welcome Hong Kongers who will flee the city in coming months, and we need to coordinate as like-minded countries a scheme to help them. And thirdly, I think we should be doing more at the United Nations with perhaps a UN special envoy. I leave you with this final thought. If Hong Kong is allowed, or rather, if those who are destroying Hong Kong's freedoms are allowed to get away with what they've done with impunity and with no response or little response from the international community, then that's not going to be the end of the story. I think Taiwan will be in Beijing's sights next. And ultimately, I think our own freedoms will be affected as well. I see Hong Kong as the front line in the struggle for freedom. And I think it's therefore in all our interests, as well as being morally right, to speak up for Hong Kongers and to do what we can to defend them. So thank you very much.